Good evening. This is Josh Wander with bringthemhome.org.il or israeltorah.org. We're here tonight back after the holidays to our weekly webinar with Rabbi Pinchas Winston of 36.org. And today's topic is creation, Eretz Yisrael, and the Jewish people. Rabbi Winston?
Thank you. Good evening and welcome back after Chagim. It's this is the time of year that we start all over again after going through a whole year of weekly Torah readings, and we start with Bereshis and building through the entire time, and we start all over again. With the creation of the world, and most people take it for granted that that's just the way it is. That's the way God dictated the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu on Mount Sinai, letter by letter, word by word, and it flows. It makes perfect sense. Why not? You begin with Bereshis, God made the world. It's exciting. It's dramatic. Gives you the roots of history and the foundations of what's going to happen from that point onward, and some direction and even a lot of Kabbalah. There's tremendous Kabbalah built in, even just to the first word, the Tikkuni Zohar, which is one of the main repositories of Kabbalistic thought, has 70 different explanations over 2 volumes of the very first word Bereshis. And I think in the past we've spoken about the word Bereshis and how it alludes to different things. But and then we go to the story of Noah and then the flood, and after that comes Avraham and his descendants, and finally Yaakov and the 12 tribes, and we go to Shmos and Exodus, and the Torah just seems to flow perfectly fine. There's no issue as far as we're concerned. I don't think we would have written any differently given the order of events. However, Rashi, the French commentator who lived around 1200, who made a point of helping us understand what's going on a simple level. He knew a lot more than he gave over, but his main thing was to make the learning of Torah and the understanding of it smoother. So it's what's called a pashtan, who gives over the simplest explanation. So if it doesn't need to be explained, he doesn't do it. There might be tremendous amount of midrashim. In fact, there are. We just talked about the Zohar now, but the Zohar is not the only source of allegorical, or we call midrashim, on the verses of the Torah itself. You have even the Gemara itself talks about different parts of the Chumash and the story of creation, make some allusions there as well. But if Rashi does say something, then usually it's because he feels there's a need to, it's important, and it's not always clear necessarily what he saw or why he felt this was important to elaborate on. And there have been books that have been written called What's Bothering Rashi, because of the fact it's not so clear to us. If you're just somebody who likes to embellish and elaborate and elucidate, understandable. That's what your job is. As the Medrash does. The Medrash will talk about all kinds of things based upon a verse, and a lot of times you wonder what the connection is, because it goes so far away from the original meaning of the verse itself that what led to that. And very often it's not clear until it comes around full circle. Then you realize, oh, that's what it was talking about. That's the reason for that. So if Rashi says something, though, it's because of the fact that he feels we need to know something. It's very important. It's crucial. And Rashi points out right at the beginning of the Chumash, from his early commentary at the very beginning there, that the Torah did not need to begin with the story of creation. It wasn't necessary. Now, it might be enjoyable, it might be entertaining, but it wasn't necessary. As far as the Torah is concerned, why is it the case? Why not? I mean, it's telling the world that God made the world. It's a very controversial topic, an issue. And here the Torah states it straight out. It's good for your faith and belief in God. Of course it belongs there. But Rashi says no. The point of the Torah, the specific point of the Torah, is to teach the commandments, the mitzvahs, the things that God told us to do that were the Jews are obligated to do, and also what we call B'nai Noach, someone who is not Jewish but holds by the Torah as well, at least as far as the 7 mitzvahs of Noach are concerned. And that's the point of it. That's why it's called Torah. And the word Mora, which means to teach, is coming to teach us about the mitzvahs. It's a technical work for the most part. All the stories and all the narrative that comes along with it is to help us understand better and to know what the background to all these mitzvahs are. But overall, it's about the mitzvahs. It's about the commandments. Not all the technical details, because that would be too much, that you'll find in the Mishnah, the oral law, that explains the verses and the mitzvahs and how to do them properly. What's kashrus? How do you shecht an animal? How do you slaughter an animal in a kosher way? That's not there in the Chumash, but it is there in the oral law. And the laws become very technical, very detailed. But in general, we learn all Taryag mitzvot, all 613 mitzvahs right from the Chumash itself. So therefore, Rashi says that that's the case. So why doesn't the Torah begin, not even the story of the Exodus, by the way, which is so fundamental to Jewish and world history, that it's hard to believe that he would leave that out. But he says, no, let's start all the way into Parshas Bo, which is the third Parsha in Sefer Shmos, the book of Exodus. We've left out the whole book of Bereshis already. And there is where God gives the first mitzvah to the Jewish people to Mekadesh the Chodesh, to sanctify the new moon, to establish the new month, which in the times that we lived in the land of Israel, and we had a Sanhedrin, the high court, and we were able to do that. So then it was done, people had to see the moon and come and report it and testify to what it looked like, to know that it was sighted, it was seen, and then we established a new month. That's what was done until eventually we lost that because we were exiled from the land and we no longer had the Sanhedrin, and the Jewish people went into the diaspora. So then Hillel came along later on, and he established the calendar which we follow to this very day. But that was the first mitzvah. And there's a fundamental mitzvah. It was a very important mitzvah because it also was a mitzvah that taught the Jewish people about their mission in life, to be a light unto nations, because the Jewish people are compared to the moon. And the phenomenally interesting thing about the moon is that it's a big, huge rock floating around in space, circling the Earth by the gravitational pull of the Earth, and yet it can be so bright. It's always giving off light, except in a lunar eclipse, when the Earth blocks the light of the sun. But when it's not happening like that, there's the moon at nighttime, very bright, and all it's doing is reflecting the light of the sun, which we can't see because it's on the other side of the Earth. And that reflects it back to us. And God says, you're compared to the moon for two reasons. Number one is that just like the moon waxes and wanes, right? It completely disappears for like almost a whole day, sometimes, less or more, but then it comes back and it starts to build once again to the 15th of the month when it's at the strongest, the full moon. And that's been Jewish history. Jewish history has been about the Jewish people going up and down, almost being destroyed, then rebuilding themselves, and unfortunately almost being destroyed again, then rebuilding themselves. There's God's way of reminding us throughout history, long after prophecy is over, that despite the fact that the world has tried to destroy us over and over again, just like Mark Twain pointed out, Mark Twain himself noticed and said that there really is no logical reason for the continued existence of the Jewish people, because of the fact that just assimilation and intermarriage and things like that alone have destroyed other cultures, but just the anti-Semitism that has added to that, why are we still here? It seems to be a miracle. And we know it is a miracle. Certainly is a miracle. And that's one of the promises that God gave to us, that would always be around no matter what. And exile is to not just to teach us a lesson about how to serve him better, but also to allow us to survive longer, because by going to exile, in a sense, we pay our dues. Otherwise, we'd have to be destroyed to pay those dues. And instead, God exiles the Jewish people. So when we look up at the moon and we sanctify it, and we basically establish the new moon, even though we don't do it through the base din anymore, we just sort of acknowledge the reality of this in the first 7 days of the new month. That's called Kish Levana, the sanctification of the new moon. And but we also remind ourselves that this is an ongoing promise that the Jewish people may wane, but they will wax once again. They will come back and rebuild themselves and last until the end of history. That's one aspect of it. But the main mitzvah is the actual establishing of the new month, and that's where the Torah should begin. That's what Rashi says. So he asked, that's bothering him. There we can tell what's bothering Rashi. He tells us exactly. And his answer is an interesting answer that, again, one could take at face value, just read it. How many people have read Rashi's answer year after year after year and never thought twice about it, never thought what it might possibly mean? But Rashi says that the Torah begins with the story of creation to let the world know that God is the creator of everything, and he's the master of the universe. Everything belongs to him. The entire land, the entire earth, the entire solar system, the entire universe, everything belongs to him. And he determines who gets what. Which land can go to which nation. It's not always obvious because God doesn't always tell them this is going to be your land, but people end up on this piece of soil, this piece of earth, and they develop themselves as a country, as a nation, and that becomes their homeland. Here, by the Jewish people, we're told specifically, Abraham was promised the land. Lech Lecha, God brought him there, and then God told him it's going to be your descendants until the descendant of Yitzchak and Yaakov, and we brought us back miraculously, and just as miraculously, if not more, in some respects, is the fact that we're here again after all this history. How did we get back here? The longing is not enough. The planning is not enough. It takes a major miracle to put us back after thousands of years on Jewish soil once again and allow us to rebuild it and make something of it and miraculously cause the desert to bloom. And Rashi says that if God says the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, it belongs to the Jewish people. How do we know? Because God said so. Where do you say so? In the Chumash. And he owns everything. So he can make that decision. Well, why is it an issue in the first place? So Rashi says, because the nations of the world at some point or at some points will accuse the Jewish people of actually stealing the land because they attacked the land of Canaan as God commanded, and they took the land from the Canaanites, the 31 kings that were living there. And they took that land and they settled themselves there because that was the commandment. They were supposed to wipe out all the Canaanites, but they didn't have the stomach for it. They came back to haunt us later on. But that's what Rashi says. Rashi says that this is for the sake of telling the world that the land belongs to the Jewish people because God gives it to them. And not even so much, it doesn't even explain because the Canaanites were depraved, and anyhow they did deserve the land, and they had to be destroyed because their lives were meaningless as far as God was concerned. It just says that God owns the land, he decides who gets it, and we were given it, and therefore there's no contest, nothing to argue about. Yeah. I mean, the first question that would have to be answered, but we're not going to go that way right now, is that who's this even talking to? Because anybody who usually argues the point that the land does not belong to the Jewish people, and certainly today, this would not fly in the UN. If you could even get in there to make the case, it wouldn't work. They would laugh you off the stage. They would tell you, you're nuts, you're crazy. We're not even sure God exists, let alone Torah came from Mount Sinai. So you're using the Bible, the Old Testament, to prove that the land belongs to you and it shouldn't be given away and divided up, and it's not going to work. So that's a question to be answered unto itself. But the amazing thing is that here at the very beginning of everything, we're talking day one. This is the beginning of creation. We're going to develop over the course of 6 days, and then all the history that's going to follow until Noah and Abraham and everybody else after that. But right there at the beginning, Eretz Yisrael is part of the picture. And we have a concept, right, that we say that what God, what happens at the end is what God planned at the beginning. That's an idea. A lot of times, and we've made this point before in the past, it's like an archer who aims for a target. He starts by pulling back the bow, and he aims, and he's got the arrow, and you don't know where he's going to put that arrow until he actually hits the target. Likewise, we're trying to figure out history and understand what's going on today with coronavirus and the elections coming up and elections here and the politics and all the various different issues of history. What's it all for? It's not as far as we're concerned, it's not accidental. According to the Medrash, according to our tradition, everything that's going to happen in history that has happened, is happening, and is going to happen was already written down and planned back at Maisa Bereshis, back at the beginning. The script was written. So how do we have free will? Not a problem, as long as we don't know what it is, and we're constantly making choices about who we are and how to be a partner with God in the fulfillment of creation. As long as we can make some kind of choice, as long as everything is unfolding before our eyes as we go along, and we can still make choice, we have free will. The fact that God knows what's going to happen doesn't make a difference to that issue whatsoever. But until we get to the end and we see how it all unfolds. But in the meantime, what about coronavirus? What about all the different things, the riots taking place, or the World War I, World War II? So many things. I mean, everything for the most part just seems to happen serendipitously, just like we didn't plan for that. And it just happened. We didn't want war, but it just happened. We didn't want, we wanted victory, but didn't think it was going to happen that way. And everything just seems to kind of happen because, a cause and effect relationship, which is true. But all of it was decided back at the beginning when God said, Boreshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz. The potential for all of history, whatever's going to unfold, whatever's going to happen, whoever's going to live, all came into existence the moment that God said, Bereshis. That first word was not just the word, it was the creation of all the potential for all of history, past our time, into the Messianic era, into the world to come. All of it was created at that time. So if we're talking about Eretz Yisrael at the beginning, right here, and Rashi points this out, this is why the Torah begins with this, then it's fundamental. It obviously means something very, very specific. And here we are, 5,781 years later, and for those who are unaware, as far as we're concerned, the Talmud says it, and Kabbalah confirms it, history as we know it is only meant to last 6,000 years from creation. There was something before creation to get to creation as part of the process to build it. There will be something after history called the world to come. But what we call Olam Hazeh, this world, lasts 6,000 years. And there's a reason for that Kabbalistically, because it's the same way, for example, that a person, their physical life is based upon their DNA, their genetics, whatever they were born with, whoever they are, however they developed, right? You can't be more than your DNA. That what you're programmed to be able to accomplish would be less, but not more. Not without some kind of engineering to change it all. So likewise, the spheres, which are the spiritual components that God created to implement his will in history, there's one for every millennium, and there's 6 specifically to control the 6,000 years of history from creation until the end of the 6,000. So you can't go past that. That is the potential for all of history until the end. And that history is divided into 3 parts, really 2 parts. Olam has a history as we have known it until now, from the time that the first man was created and really kicked out of the Garden of Eden until today, because it's a one long continuous history, changing all the time, but it's one history. Then we'll enter what's called the Messianic era. Hopefully not after that. We won't need the war of Gog and Magog, but that's what the prophets talk about. That's the threshold to the next stage of history, when evil is banished from creation, and we begin what's called the Messianic era, or the Yemos Mashiach from the in Hebrew. And within Yemos Mashiach period of time, you're going to have something called Techiyas HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, that will also take place until the year 6,000. And 6,000, last person turns the lights off, because all of creation is elevated, and we begin to live a more eternal existence like we had in the beginning, before the sin, in this week's Torah portion of eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But even more so, it gets even more eternal than the first man, Adam Harishon, was able to know. But we're seeing all of history come to a conclusion. We're coming very close to the end. Even though 6,000 years is still 200 some odd years left, but that 200 years includes Yemos Mashiach, the Messianic era, the Techiyas HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, and there's no Yetzer Hara, there's no evil inclination, and mankind is utopian from that point. So our history, we call Halom Hazeh, is coming down to, it's winding down. It's coming to its conclusion in our lifetime. And who knows how much longer it will be like this, where it's going to go from this point. But unquestionably, here we are, thousands of years later, after all was took place in the 6 days of creation back at the first moment. There was a gap. There was a break. The Jewish people were exiled from their land for 2,000 years. It was a barren place. Almost every nation that conquered that part of the world came and tried to settle the land and make it work and make it grow, and it didn't work for them. It was a strategic point, for sure, because that was like the opening to Asia. You could land someplace on the coast of Eretz Yisrael, and then that opened up, to Asia. If you didn't go further north, through Syria, Lebanon, but make it work as a homeland or as an extension, as a colonial part of an empire, it just didn't work, didn't respond. So the land literally remained fallow for a couple of thousand years, just like the Torah said it would when the Jewish people were gone. And then we came back, and here we are after thousands of years back in the land. And once again, Eretz Yisrael is a seminal issue. It's a central topic in the world. And even though right now we're experiencing an interesting period of time where we're finally making peace with some of the Arab nations that at one point maybe they're backed our destruction or directly were involved with it, because I think they came to realize it was better for everybody if we just build as opposed to destroy. And after trying so many times and failing, may have realized that this wasn't worth it anymore. But nonetheless, the land is still contentious. There's still people advocating dividing up, taking pieces away, denying the Jewish people parts that they had built up, just like in Gush Katif, which was built up, and it was a wonderful place and a phenomenal accomplishment, and we were stripped of it in the end, and the families that lived there pretty much never recovered from what happened to them when this took place, and it became a terrorist state for the most part. But this right back at the beginning, built in. So Rashi, when he wrote that, at the time that he wrote that, there were crusades going on. The Jewish people, if they were there, they were being slaughtered by Christians because they wouldn't convert, or they would convert, which is even worse, spiritually speaking. But he made that comment. It's not his comment. He received it as a tradition from his Rebbe, who got from his Rebbe going back in time, telling us at the beginning that Eretz Yisrael is going to be an issue at the end of history, which it has been, and it is. And this is something to pay attention to, because just like everything is important because of its connection to what's going on. Likewise, if we're seeing the fulfillment of this Rashi going back in the beginning, this Rashi is talking about this, and here we are living through that importance and how the world is in fact contesting the Jewish ownership of the land altogether, or partially, or the authority that we have to control the land, as Rashi predicted, or as Rashi wrote back then it means the whole generation is unique in that respect. And we have to pay attention to that. We have to, think to ourselves that, is this just like history randomly unfolding, or is this literally the fulfillment of the beginning and purpose of creation? Because we're the end result. What God planned to do, we're the target that was hit by the arrow of God. In Noah's time, a little bit, but not much. There was still a lot of history that could be lived out. The Torah was supposed to be received, according to the Medrash, by Noah. Noah was supposed to be Moshe and receive Torah. Yeah, that's what's supposed to happen. In fact, the Arizal writes on this week's parsha, in his work Sharp Psukim, that Noah and Moshe are very much connected. In fact, when Moshe Rabbeinu stands on the temple, on Har Sinai, when God is threatening to destroy the Jewish people because of their involvement with the golden calf, and Moshe pleads that they should be saved. They shouldn't be killed. They shouldn't be wiped out. And God accepts his apology on behalf of the Jewish people. And only the perpetrators were killed in the end, and the rest of the Jewish nation was allowed to survive and continue on. And Moshe realized it was an Eis Ratzon once he got it. It was a propitious time to make requests. So he uses the word imatzatsi che benecha. If I have found favor in your eyes, show me your glory. Share that with me. And the Arizal explains, sounds familiar because we know from the end of this week's parsha that Noach was saved because he was matzeh chen b'nei Hashem. That God looked at Noach and he liked him. Noach had chen. He found chen in the eyes of God, and that saved him and his family as a result of that. And when Moshe says this, he's alluding to the fact that he is a Gilgul, a reincarnation of Noach. And the Arizal goes even further. He says, when Moshe prayed for the whole nation and said to God, if you're not going to forgive them and you're going to wipe them out, then erase my name from your book. Blot me out. I don't want to be in the Sefer anymore. I don't want to be in the Torah. If they're going to go, I don't want any part of this whatsoever. God says, I decide who gets written in the book, who doesn't get written in the book. But anyhow, I hear what you're saying. I'll forgive them anyhow. So the Arizal says that this actually is a rectification for Noach. Because one of the complaints about Noach that the Medrash brings down is that Noach did not pray for his generation. God comes to Noach and he says, I've had enough. The world is too corrupt. Even the people who, it's not that they even know it's corruption, it's a way of life. It's one thing to be an honest person and to cheat once in a while. And that. We stand in Yom Kippur, we beat our chests because of the sin we did, because of something. We make mistakes. We cheat. We also get corrupted from time to time. That's what it means to be human, unfortunately, for the time being. Shouldn't be. We're becoming a righteous person, but we have Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur is intense. And it's intense with all these different vidu and confessional prayers because we make mistakes. And how many people can go to the list and say, I didn't do that one? And if you do think you didn't do that one, look at the commentaries and see what they say about it, because very often, and this actually happened to me one year, I thought to myself, well, this is not so relevant to me. And I read the commentary and all the different ways that you can actually do this prohibition, and I was in there too. You can find different aspects of it that apply to just about everybody, and that's what it is. So God says in Noach, I'm going to bring a flood and wipe the world out. At that point in time, Noach's response should have been, I got to stop this. There must be a way to stop it. God tells Yonah later on, much later on, the time of Nineveh. We read this in Yom Kippur too. Mincha Haftorah Yom Kippur, the story of Yonah and the fish, the big fish. And, he tells Yonah that Nineveh has become a corrupt place, and I'm not gonna survive it anymore. I'm not gonna allow them to go on this way. I'm going to destroy the city, and go tell them that if they don't repent, they don't do tshuva in 30 days, they're gone. Right? That's the end of it. And so Yonah doesn't want to go first. So that's why he's swallowed by the fish. But eventually, Yonah ends up in Nineveh because you can run, but you can't hide. God found him. God knew exactly where he was. He sent him in the end to Nineveh to tell them, and the people repented and did tshuva. It's possible. You can have an impact on people. In fact, God had Noach build the ark for 120 years. It took 120 years to finish the ark. Now, probably it could be finished a little earlier. It was a very big boat without power tools, and one family doing it and had to support all those animals and humans, and there were 3 levels and make it waterproof. 120 years is a long time, a lot of time. And why was it 120 years? Because people would walk by and say to Noach, what you building? And Noach would say, I'm building an ark, right? And they'd say, what's an ark? And he'd say, well, it's a big boat, And why are you building a boat up in the mountains? The water's all the way down there. So Noach said, no problem. The water's going to come up to here. God is bringing a flood and he's going to destroy mankind. And then people should shake in their boots and do tshuva. They laughed instead. That's what people do. They laugh. They're laughing today. They laugh. People laugh. Cognitive dissonance. They don't believe. As As someone said, an accident is something that happens to somebody else. A crisis is somebody else's crisis until it happens to you, but then it becomes real. But in the meantime, how many people think about it as if it's happening to them before it happens, and to avoid it altogether? They laughed at Noah. They thought he was a meshuggah. It's crazy, doesn't make sense, didn't believe that God spoke to him. So Noah should have prayed, God, help me out of here. I'm trying to impact the people. I'm trying to bring them back. I know that we can avert this evil decree if we can bring back the people, but I can't bring back the people because they're all laughing at me, building an ark. How am I supposed to prove that this came from you and it's real? Pray. He didn't pray. So it says that when Moshe Rabbeinu stood on top of Mount Sinai and prayed for the Jewish people at that time, that was the tikkun for Noach, because Noach reincarnated into Moshe. Not all of Noach, but a part of Noach. And Moshe knew this apparently and alluded to it when he said, if I find grace, because the word chen also is the reverse of Noach. So this is an allusion to Noach as well. And the 120 years is significant because the first person to live the 120 years was Moshe Rabbeinu. Even though God says, that's it, people are living too long, they don't appreciate what they have, and I'm going to shorten their lifespans. But that didn't happen for a long time. Even Aaron Cohen, who's Moshe's brother, lived until 123. And you go back in time, hundreds of years, people were still living a long time. Shais himself lived until 970, I believe, like his father. Moshe was the first person to live until 120. And then it gets less and less and less as time goes on. Not for everybody. Some people still live longer, but overall, that's the case. So there's a very strong connection between Moshe and Noach. Now, it makes sense why you see, for example, the Gemara says, interesting enough, the Talmud says, where is there a hint to Moshe in the Torah? Because we know the Torah makes all kinds of hints to all kinds of things. It's divine, it's gematria, it's a very mysterious work. On one hand, it's very clear what's being said, but also there's Kabbalah, there's all Midrashim, there's deep levels. So there must be a hint to Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah. Now, it's not the only one they ask about. The Gemara, the Talmud also says, where is there a hint to Mordechai and Esther in the story of Purim, and Haman also for the story of Purim? And we can understand that. You know why? Because they came along much later in history. The Torah is already closed. There was nothing to add to at that point in time. So if you want to, refer to them in the Torah, it can only be by hint, by some kind of prophecy. That God, of course, the Torah is the blueprint for creation. So even though the Torah ends at 2488 with the death of Moshe Rabbeinu at that time, nevertheless, it is the blueprint for creation. So therefore, whatever is going to happen since then, certainly during then, but since then, by definition, has to be in the Torah somewhere. So Ben Bagbag in Pirkei Avos says, turn it over, keep going through the Torah this way, that way, backwards, forwards, up and down, Kabbalah, it's all in there, the whole thing, all of history. You name it, there's nothing that by definition has existed that's happening, even the most absurd and maybe even perverted thing, by definition cannot exist if there's not some potential for it alluded to in the Torah itself. So Mordechai and Esther, why not? Of course, that's a significant holiday. We didn't see it coming, but then it happened. And once it happened, whoa, clearly this is divine providence, and it's important because also wouldn't have made such a big deal. It wouldn't have happened such a big, huge way where the Jewish people were almost destroyed completely, and then they come back and they defeat the enemy instead. So Mordechai and Esther, therefore, must be somehow alluded to in the Torah. And the Gemara brings examples of these certain words, key phrases in the Torah that actually allude to Haman. Haman is actually alluded to right in this week's Parsha. Hamina eats, God says, from this tree did you eat? And the word Hamin is an interrogative, but it's the letters of Haman's name. And this is an allusion to Haman because really the creation of Haman came as a result of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But that's a class unto itself. Very important idea, but not for the time being. But that's the source. And Mordechai Esther is in Parshas V'yelech, where God talks about hiding his face, and there was a holiday of hiding his face. Esther is the panim. I'll hide the word Esther comes from the word steer. I'll hide. And Mordechai, mar dror, which is one of the spices used in the incense, mentioned in Parashat Kisisa, and there's a reason why that specifically, the number. But wait a second. Moshe? Where is Moshe alluded to in the Torah? What do you need an allusion for? It's called Torah Moshe, first of all. He gave it over. God named it for him. Torah Moshe. Came from him. Came from God through him. but his name is mentioned blatantly, out in the open. Who knows? Like hundreds of times? A lot of times. Moshe. What are you need an allusion for? And even stranger is the Gemara's answer. The Gemara says, Ushbagam. In the Torah, this week's Parsha, when God is deciding he's going to destroy mankind, he mentions, and he's only flesh and blood. He's only flesh. That's all he is. Man, can wipe away just like that. Ubashagam hu basar. Ubashagam, the word means, and also he's flesh. And the Gemara says you add up, the Gemara doesn't say, the Gemara says that just brings that word down, but Rashi explains on the Gemara, because Rashi's not only in the Chumash, Rashi's in the Gemara as well. He was very busy, right? And he explains the gematria of the word b'shagam is the gematria of Moshe. So that's the allusion. That word there is an allusion to Moshe, even though Moshe is written about all over the place. So the pre-Tzaddik, Rav Tzadok HaKohen explains, therefore we learn from this, there's no way the Gemara is asking where is there an allusion to Moshe, because we have all these explicit examples. The Gemara is asking where is there an allusion to the fact that Noah could have been Moshe in his time to bring down the Torah, to give it to mankind, because as he explains, excuse me, every 10 generations is a special opportunity to change the world for better. And Noah was that 10th generation from the creation of Adam Arishon. And he had the power. He had the soul capacity to do it. But he didn't. He failed at that mission for the time being. And therefore mankind went Torahless. But every energy that God creates for good it doesn't just go back. It has to be used up some way. And this has very dramatic implications for history. I mean, you can write through the Holocaust, you can see how this is true. But if God put a specific energy into the world at a particular time to accomplish a specific purpose, and it's not used for that purpose, it will be used in a negative way instead, usually. So how is that the case over here? Well, how many days did it rain? Day and night. How many days altogether? 40 days and 40 nights. Why that many? Because 40 is a number of development, gestation, completion, 40 years in the desert, 400 years in Egypt, in a land not your own. It's a very significant number in that respect. So 40 is very important here. And how many days did the waters surge from below? 150. The waters came up from the depths below for 150 days before they finally subsided. So the priest explains, that sounds very familiar, because how many days and nights was Moshe Rabbeinu on top of Mount Sinai receiving the Torah, the written Torah, and the oral Torah as well? How many altogether? 40 days and 40 nights. Oh, corresponds. Interesting, right? And the priest goes on to explain the Torah Shebal Peh, which is the oral law, which basically is us applying the written law and the tradition from the oral law that's been known. For example, can you turn a light bulb on Shabbos? Did God tell Moshe Rabbeinu about light bulbs? Maybe yes, maybe no. Did Moshe Rabbeinu tell the people about light bulbs? They said, what's a light bulb? Oh, don't worry about it. You're descending all the way down. One day, there'll be something called a light bulb you can't turn on Shabbos. No, it's not what happened. Instead, when they finally created a light bulb, they came to the Gedolei Hador, right, the leading rabbis of that generation, and they said to them, this is what mankind has created. What does it mean in terms of Shabbos? So they examined it and took it apart, and they understood the principles of how it works and how a switch works and all that, and found that the malachas, the principal activities that we avoid doing these things on Shabbos that they apply to, and said you can't turn a light bulb on Shabbos itself. Before Shabbos you can use a Shabbos clock, a timer, also is to do that. But to actually turn on the switch, no, that you can't do. Why? Because that's like building a fire, because it was incandescent light. What about fluorescence? A different discussion. But turning the switch on is like building it. But they applied it. And that comes through us. That wisdom, we have as a tradition that God gives to the leaders specifically to enable them to direct us. We need to know what to do. The world's constantly changing, constantly advancing. Technology has had a tremendous impact on the application of Torah halacha. The principles have never changed. They are set in stone, literally back then and all through history. That's the commandments. The world was built upon those commandments. No reason to change. God's eternal. He knows exactly what's going to exist forever. When he gave the commandments, it took into account everything. But the applications, the rabbis of each generation had to decide what to do about this particular thing. Is this food kosher? Is this food not kosher? Is this method of koshering okay? They had to look at that and examine it and compare it to what we knew from the past and come up with the conclusions. It's kind of a form of prophecy, or ruach hakodesh, of divine inspiration, or just simply siyata d'shmaya, heavenly help. But that's their job. They don't get it for nothing. They work for years. They learn the entire Talmud backwards and forward till they know it basically off by heart. And that's just that. Then all the commentators that go with it and all the response, they make sure they know the full gamut of Torah, but they don't know. They look up later on to apply it. But that comes through them. That's the oral law that comes through us. It's the word that Yeshaya says God puts into our mouth. And it comes through three levels of soul. One's called nefesh, one's called ruach, and one's called chayim. Sorry, one's called the shama. What about it's called chayim? Right? Ruach, nefesh, ruach, and the shama. And each of these levels of soul, Kabbalistically, have 50 levels into themselves, called the 50 gates of understanding. They each have their own sets of 50. 50 times 3 is 150. So the waters came down from heaven for 40 days and 40 nights, like the Torah that Moshe brought down from Shemaim after being there for 40 days and 40 nights. But the waters surged from below, because of the fact that it corresponded to the Torah that comes through us and our 3 levels of soul and the 50 gates of understanding. Because that was the power that existed in that generation to instead give Torah. To what Moshe did later on, another 16 generations later on, what he did later, that's what Noach is supposed to do here. So Moshe fixes it up in his time, but only for the Jewish people, not for the whole world. And it would have avoided the flood, but the flood happened in the end, and creation was rebooted. Right? History 2.0. And that is all built in. As a side point, it's just interesting to point out how history flows and runs. It's after Cain kills his brother Hevel, and then God pronounces judgment, and then Cain says, well, it's too much for me to handle, and God says that okay, so anybody who kills you will be avenged for 7. You come Shivatayim, for 70 generations, 70 years, you'll be avenged. Or actually, it's 7 sets of 7, and the word "you come," which means will be avenged, actually is the letters Yud, Kuf, and Mem. And the reason why it's that, says the Arizal, is because these letters are the first letters of the names of the future reincarnations of Cain, who killed his brother, to rectify him. The Yud is the first letter of Yisroel. The Kuf is the first letter of the name Korach, who we don't see till later on in Parshas Korach. And the Mem actually stands for Mitzri, which means the Egyptian. Which Egyptian? Lots of Egyptians. Well, one specific Egyptian. And what was that specific Egyptian? That was the one that Moshe killed. When did Moshe kill an Egyptian? Well, right back in Parshas Shmos. Moshe goes out and sees that there's an Egyptian beating up a Jew, and Moshe tells this Egyptian to stop, and then he kills him because he doesn't do it, and then buries him in the ground. How does Moshe kill him? He kills him by using what we call the Shem HaMeforish. It's one of God's names that we don't pronounce today the way it's written because it's too holy, but it was powerful. The Kohanim used to pronounce it in the times of the temple, but in general, no one today can use that name. but Moshe knew the name, and I think it was written on his staff as well. And Moshe actually didn't have a staff yet, so didn't have it there. But Moshe used this name, and this name caused the soul of the Egyptian to come out of him. And the reason why Moshe did this was because Moshe knew that a piece of Cain's soul was inside this Egyptian and wanted the rectification process to begin. Why Moshe specifically? Oh, because Moshe is the reincarnation of Hevel, the brother that Cain killed. So Moshe is like a reenactment of this relationship. In fact, later on in Parshas Yisroel, when Yisroel himself, or Yitro, as people might know him, or Jethro in English, goes out with his daughter, Moshe's wife and children, to meet Moshe at Mount Sinai. Here first he says, Ani Yisro, it's like that. I forget the name, but if you look at the Aleph Ches Yud, yeah, I am your father-in-law Yisro, and the Rizal explains that the first letters of each of those words, put them together, spell the word Achi, I'm your brother, because Yisro knew that he also was a reincarnation of Cain, and Hevel was, Moshe was the reincarnation of Hevel. Gets even more interesting than this. Why did Cain kill Hevel in this week's Parsha? What was the point of that? Why did he do that? So, it says he was jealous. God looked at the sacrifice of Cain, didn't like it, even though he was the first one to bring it, and looked what Hevel brought and thought, well, that's much better. This is the best of his and this is the least of his. He doesn't care about trying to appease me or at least thank me for what I gave to him. So therefore, I'm not going to pay attention to that sacrifice. So Cain got jealous of that attention that Hevel got, and he killed his brother. So the Medrash says, no, that's not the real reason why. The real reason why was because each of them was born with a twin sister, except that Hevel was born with two twin sisters. You don't hear about them in the Chumash, but the Medrash tells you that. Hevel had two twin sisters, and Cain had one twin sister. And in those days, that's who you married. In those days, that's all there was. There wasn't another family. God didn't make two families at the beginning. He made one family, and the only way to get married was to marry the sisters. So Cain was jealous of Hevel's extra twin sister. So therefore, he killed him and took her. It was over this. Here's the fascinating part. So we're saying that Yisro, later on, is the reincarnation, is the good part of Cain. And Moshe, who's now his son-in-law, or going to become his son-in-law, is the reincarnation of Hevel. And Cain killed Hevel over a twin sister. And what does Yisro do? Yisro gives his daughter Tzipporah to Moshe to be his wife. Guess what? Guess who Tzipporah is the reincarnation of? Turns out the twin sister that Hevel was killed over by his brother. So by Yisro giving Tzipporah to Moshe, this was Cain making amends to Hevel, his brother, by giving Tzipporah instead to Moshe as his wife. Mind-blowing. I mean, if you think about what's going on over here, it just goes to show you how intricate history is. We just see people today who they are. I am so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, but who were they previously? And why are they doing this? And why are they going through that? And why they experience life like that? Why are they married to this person? Well, this goes all, ripples all through history in the end. For example, we said that Korach is also the reincarnation of Cain as well. And he shows up much later on in history. But what does he do? He challenges Moshe Rabbeinu. He challenges Moshe. He says, you know something? We're all holy people. It doesn't make sense that only you should be the leader of everything. And Aaron is the high priest. Share it sounds like nepotism. Share some of that power with the rest of us. And Moshe says, it's not me. I didn't decide. God is the one who determined how all this should play out, not me. And I'll prove it to you. He says, if the earth will open its mouth and swallow you up, that will show that everything I've done is by the word of God. But if you die a natural death like all other people do, then you're right. It's me. But Moshe, of course, knew that it wasn't him, so he had no problem stating this. And of course, the earth opens its mouth and swallows up Korach. Does that sound familiar at all? Yeah. Well, I think back in time, it says that when God approached Cain and said, "Where is your brother?" and Cain pronounced those famous words that ring out all through history, "Shomer achi anochi," am I my brother's keeper? Do I know where he is? He's doing his thing, I'm doing my thing. And God says, "You're just a liar. Come on, you're talking to God over here. I know exactly. I gave you a chance to do tshuva, and you pretended like I didn't know what was going on. I knew exactly. The earth, the mouth of the earth has swallowed the blood of your brother." So measure for measure, because the Gemara says that's the way God works. Measure for measure, always measure for measure. So what do they do? So later on, Korach's died. He's swallowed up by the earth. It's all fixing up the soul of Cain, all through history. And we don't even know the half of it. We only know as far as Shar HaGilgulim explains and Shar Psukim explain. The point I'm driving at through all of this, from the beginning to the end, is how all the roots are in this week's Parsha. Very often, Simchas Torah comes in the middle of the week. You don't have much time to prepare for Parshas Bereshis, unless you start early, but no, who does that? We're still finishing up the Varim. Parshas also Brocha, it's going to come up. People squeeze Bereshis into 2 or 3 days, or somebody's in 1 day. It's happened where, I had to go to prepare the Parsha, the whole Parsha within 2 days, basically. It takes, going very fast. You're trying to pay attention. It's time consuming. There's a lot of Rashis, a lot of Meforshim, but you feel such a chaval, such a waste, because you know all the roots of all of history. The internet, of course, the tree of knowledge, good and evil. That's the basis of that. That you want to know where the internet comes from. Well, don't look at modern day technology. They're just the ones who brought it into existence. But the roots of the internet, this week's Parsha, tree of knowledge, good and evil, clear. Well, if you know the background to it and how history is set up based upon the correlations of the days of creation and the millennia of history, it's all, I got books on this. You can look up online. But the point is that all the roots are in this week's Parsha. And they'll start to grow out in the Parshas, all the different Parshas that follow. And we have to look at that. We have to pay attention. Because even though here we are, 2020, almost 2021, 5781. That's more accurate because it gives you the whole thing. The Western didn't need to go back to 1 BCE and then go backwards negatively. There's only one number, consecutive from creation, 5,781 years. Is the Bible relevant? Is the Torah relevant today? A person, if you're religious, it's your dogma and you live by it. So therefore you're learning, you have to. But is it relevant? Does it really have what to say about today? Our whole life today is based upon it. Everything that's unfolding, that's going on at this stage of history, and will even more so, we are that arrow on the way to its target, and it will be a bullseye no matter what happens. Because God's the most professional archer there is. If he aims for a target, he hits it smack on. And we are that arrow as we get towards the end of history. This is not the time to space out. This is not the time to say, I'm going to do my own thing and not pay attention, just like pretend it's all something else going on. It's all to teach. It's all for the sake of directing us. We're responding. That's how we work. We respond to circumstances. This happens, we respond. I didn't expect that to happen, but it did happen. So because it did happen, I had to do something about it. I wasn't going to do something about it. I didn't know it existed. But now that it happened the way it did, I have to make a choice now. That's what all of this has been about, making choices. Because at the end of the day, Maaseh Bereshis, creation, was made for a very specific reason, for mankind to have free will. Bechira. Free will. Free will? Free of what? You have to pay for it? What does it mean, free? Free of the Yetzer Hara, to make moral decisions, to be able to say, I feel like doing that, but I know the right thing is to do this instead. So I'm going to do that, even though I really want to, but this is the right thing. What was it? Right thing? What does it mean? Like, so what? It's the right thing. Big deal. Is it the fun thing? No. Is it the popular thing? No. But it's the right thing. So, it's not a world that rewards the right thing that much, which is why a lot of people aren't doing it, why it's not so attractive, why those who stand up and try to do it usually get bashed right back down again and have to suffer terrible consequences from people who don't care about the right thing. They want to do it that works for them, it feels comfortable. They don't believe in the world to come. They don't believe in eternal judgment. Things like that. That's not part of it. It's right now, the here and now. But the person that believes, understands that we're reaching that end, we're now getting to the point of the fulfillment of the purpose of creation. It was in this week's parsha, at the very beginning. And Eretz Yisrael is so central to all of it. So central. How do you feel about it? What do you believe about it? Do you believe what God said back at the beginning? Do you believe do you believe in God? No? Check it out. Either prove it to yourself or disprove it, but don't just sit on the fence, because the world's made for free will. Torah from Mount Sinai, do you believe in it? How can that be? Well, he believes, yeah, but he's not so smart, but he does, and he's very smart, and she too. And there's a lot of people out there with very intelligent, who seem to believe. You think it's just like a habit? Ask a question, find out, because we are the fulfillment of history, and here's the choice we get to make. Either we can be a star in all of that. We can be one of the top paid actors, so to speak, who get to be on stage and say the words and read the script and become famous and win the awards and all that. Not in Hollywood, but in Shemayim, in heaven, where it counts the most. Or just a second on the set, or a third in the set. It's just someone walking in the background, because that's all they're there for. They don't say anything, don't do it. They're just there to make it look real. But it's not really what life's about. So we're about to read it and finish it in Parshas Bereshis, but here are the roots. Take the time. At least think about it. Understand it. Read the Midrashim. Read the stories. Get some background to what's going on, because this is where we learn the best what we should be doing from this point onward. Great week. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Winston, for your beautiful shiur. I want to take this opportunity to mention that this is being sponsored by IsraelTorah.org, as well as Israel 365. You mentioned your books. Let me just show people, if people are interested in getting to those books. Rabbi Winston has a website, which is at 36, spelled out 36.org. And over there, you can see all of his books are represented over there, or sold over there. That's where I would recommend you go. Also, I would recommend that you go and see our website at israeltorah.org or bringthemhome.org.il, where we have lots of information about the ingathering of the exiles, lots of videos, and that brings us to our YouTube channel, which is Israel Torah. And that Israel Torah, I'd recommend that you go to that channel and you subscribe and press the bell in order to get notified when we put up new videos. We have new videos posting all the time, including these live webinars, which are done weekly. And again, we appreciate your time, Rabbi Winston. There were a lot of great comments, and I appreciate everybody writing in from all the different platforms. And we look forward to hearing from you next week.
Thank you. Have a good week.
Thank you. Be well.